You say
Yes.
that
So much truth.
All right, let's get this kicked off. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Julie Slama. I'm the senator for the 1st Legislative District in Southeast Nebraska. I'm chair of this committee. The committee will take up bills in the order posted. Our hearing today is your public part of the legislative process. This is your opportunity to express your position on the proposed legislation before us today. Committee members will come and go during the hearing. We've got bills to introduce in other committees and are called away for that reason. It's not an indication that we are not interested in the bill being heard. It's just part of the process. To better facilitate today's proceedings, I ask you to abide by the following procedures. Please silence or turn off your cell phones. Move to the front row when you're about ready to testify. Order of testimony will be as follows: introducer, proponents, opponents, neutral, and then close if the introducer chooses. Testifiers, please sign in. Hand your pink sign-in sheet to the committee clerk when you come up to testify. Spell your name for the record before you testify, and be concise. It's my request that you limit your testimony to 3 minutes. If you will not be testifying at the microphone but want to go on record as having a position on a bill being heard today, there are white tablets at each entrance where you may leave your name and other pertinent information. These sign-in sheets will become exhibits in the permanent record at the end of today's hearing. Written materials may be distributed to committee members as exhibits only while testimony is being offered. Hand them to the page for distribution to the committee, and staff when you come up to testify. We need 10 copies. And if you have written testimony but don't have 10 copies, please raise your hand now so one of our pages can help make copies for you. To my immediate right is Committee Counsel Joshua Cristalier. To my left at the end of the table is Committee Clerk Natalie Shunk. The committee members with us today will introduce themselves, beginning on my far right.
Senator George Dungan, LD 26 in Northeast Lincoln.
Bo Ballard, LD 21, Northwest Lincoln and Northern Lancaster County.
Kathleen Kauth, LD 31, Millard.
I'm Senator Mike Jacobson, District 42. I'm in Hooker, Thomas, McPherson, Logan, Lincoln, and 3/4 of Perkins County. Live in North Platte.
Ray Aguilar, District 35, Grand Island.
Brad Von Gillern, District 4, West Omaha. Elliot Bostar, District 29.
Also assisting the committee today are our wonderful committee pages, Caitlin and Isabel. The committee will take up bills today in the following order: LB 383 and LB 308. And with that, we'll open the hearing on LB 383. Welcome, Senator Bostar. It is your afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Slama and members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. For the record, my name is Elliot Bostar, that's ELIOTBOSTAR, and I represent Legislative District 29, and I'm here today to present LB 383, as well as a lot of other bills. Last year, I introduced and the legislature passed LB 739, which required health insurance policies to include colorectal screening coverage and laboratory tests for any non-symptomatic person age 45 or older, in line with the recommendations of the United States Preventive Services Task Force. This year, I continue the effort of improving access to colorectal cancer screening by introducing LB 383, which requires insurers to cover colonoscopy screenings and annual non-colonoscopy at-home tests as approved by the United States Preventive Task Force without cost-sharing requirements. Currently, individuals who receive a positive test from a non-colonoscopy preventative screening are required to have a follow-up colonoscopy performed to complete the cancer screening. However, these colonoscopies are treated by insurers as a diagnostic exam instead of a screening, and are therefore subject to cost sharing. A colonoscopy is a standalone test when used for screening. Non-colonoscopy at-home tests may be standalone when test results are negative. However, 5 to 7% of approved at-home tests will be positive when performed on an annual basis. A positive at-home test requires a follow-up colonoscopy in order to complete the screening process. Such a colonoscopy is not diagnostic, but an integral part of the screening examination and should therefore be covered with no cost sharing for individuals. Colorectal cancer is the third leading cause of all cancer-related deaths in men and women in the United States. Starting in 2012, national data shows that there has been a rising incidence of 2% a year in colorectal cancer diagnoses in people younger than age 50. Recognizing this trend and taking action by removing barriers to colorectal cancer screenings is critical to saving lives. Screening can prevent cancer through the detection and removal of precancerous growths. Screenings can also detect cancer at an early stage when treatment is usually less extensive, less expensive, and more successful. Encouraging greater use of less expensive and minimally invasive at-home testing could result in higher screening rates and lower healthcare costs for both insurers and patients. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I encourage the committee to advance LB 383, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Senator Bostar. Are there any questions from the committee? See none, thank you.
There's the amendment I distributed is a small amendment that it's a cleanup amendment that shifts a line around. It's not that significant.
Sounds good. Are there any questions from the committee after we heard that? Okay, seeing none, thank you. All right, we'll now open it up for proponent testimony on LB 383. And if you are planning to be a proponent on this bill, it's not like church, please make your way up to the front row.
My name is Alan Thorson. It's AlanThorson. I'm here to testify as a proponent of LB 383, representing the Nebraska Medical Association and the Nebraska Cancer Coalition. Both organizations, I think, were explained earlier today, so you should be familiar with that representation. I have provided a written document that is full of statistics and information that may be of help and you make a decision about this bill, but I did want to take this time actually to explain a little bit more about the difference between stool-based tests and colonoscopy. Senator Bostar has already done a pretty good job of this, but stool-based tests can be blood-based. Okay, that's we have an FOBT or a FIT test. It can be a DNA type test. It can be as opposed to our visual exams, which are colonoscopy. Okay, the visualization exams like colonoscopy are excellent because they can actually prevent colorectal cancer by removing precancerous polyps. Okay, the stool-based tests are better actually at detecting a cancer early when it's still very treatable, beatable, and curable. So they're all excellent tests, but they have a little bit different direction. The big thing, you might say, well, why would people select one over the other? And a lot of it has to do with cost, okay? And of course, when you have someone less than a Medicare age, then they're subject to private insurance coverage, which was helped a lot by last year's passage of the law that Dr. Bostar talked about. But the problem with and as people select a stool-based test because it's cheap, okay? It's easy. They can do it at home. It doesn't require a bowel prep, which takes several hours. They don't have to take a day off from work, which can be a significant factor for working people less than Medicare age. But as Senator Bostar indicated, sorry, congratulations. As he indicated, at the present time, it's possible if you have a symptom, bleeding, a positive stool test that's considered a symptom, then the follow-up colonoscopy could be considered diagnostic and subject to cost sharing. While it's critical to understand that actually that follow-up colonoscopy is an inherent part of the screening examination when you start that examination process with a stool test, okay? My positivity rate that I would quote for a stool test is, I would say a little bit higher. I'd say about 10 to 15% because people with non-cancerous issues, colitis and things also can be positive and could end up needing a colonoscopy. But even at that rate, if you had the more people you have doing stool tests, and this affects rural Nebraskans particularly as we study the statistics, that means that 85 to 90 people out of 100 who otherwise should have a colonoscopy actually could avoid a colonoscopy and instead do the stool-based test and have the colonoscopy only if that's positive. Significant potential cost savings. I'll stop there. And if there's any questions about all that, be happy to try to answer those.
Thank you,
Yes.
Dr. Thorson. Senator Cal.
Thank you, Senator Sama. So you mentioned the rural districts. Does this allow people in rural communities greater access? Because it's mailed to them, correct?
It's,
This stool-based test.
They can be mailed in. Is that what you asked?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So it provides, it does not take time away from work. It does allow them to be screened at home and they can be mailed in. Now, and also some of our rural residents are quite a ways from access to colonoscopy. If it comes back positive, they're going to have to make arrangements for that colonoscopy, but 85 to 90% of the time they won't have to do that. So it's a big potential benefit for residents of rural Nebraska.
Thank you, Senator Cal. Any additional committee questions? Seeing none, thank you, Dr. Thorson.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair Slama and members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Gina Ragland, Jinaragland. Here today testifying in support of LB 383 on behalf of ARP Nebraska. You've already heard colorectal cancer is the third most common cancer diagnosed in both men and women and the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States, causing more than 52,000 deaths per year, according to the CDC. But about 1/3 of adults skip suggested screenings that can prevent or help treat the deadly disease. Often the reason for skipping screenings is due to lack of insurance coverage, out-of-pocket costs, the preparation, missing work, and so forth. Colorectal cancer is almost entirely preventable by taking advantage of recommended screenings and other prognostic tests, including the colonoscopy, which is considered the gold standard for early detection and prevention of cancers of the colon and rectum. At-home screening tests for colon cancer are an alternative that often can be more convenient and less invasive as an alternative for some patients, leading to earlier diagnosis and a better prognosis. At-home colon cancer screening kits reduce the hassle of preparing for and recovering from a colonoscopy. The kits, as we said, arrive in the mail and the patient sends them back to the lab for interpretation, which eliminates the need for patients to take a day off from work or arrange for transportation or having a caregiver that might also have to take time away to transport them to and from. Half of all new diagnoses of colorectal cancer in the United States are now in people 66 or younger, according to the American Cancer Society. That statistic, according to the ACS, illuminates that what its researchers found in compiling their 2020 edition of colorectal cancer statistics. The burden of colorectal cancer has shifted in recent years to younger people who are less vigilant than older adults in keeping up with colorectal cancer screenings. LB 383 conforms with the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force test procedural recommendations. We know that colon cancer screenings save lives, and LB 383 will provide an additional avenue for accessing such preventative screenings for Nebraskans. Thank you to Senator Bostar, Dr. Bostar, for introducing the legislation, and we would ask you to support the bill in advance from committee, and I would be more than happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ragland. Are there any questions from the committee? See none, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Hello again. Thank you, Senator Slama and committee. My name is Dr. Lina Bostwick. That's LINA-BOSTWICK. And I'm here again on behalf of the Nebraska Nurses Association, which is 30,000 registered nurses. And according to the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services from 2023, colon cancer is the fourth most diagnosed cancer in Nebraska, yet ranks 41st in screening rates. Screening leads to early diagnosis of colorectal cancer, which is a key to long-term survival. A colonoscopy is a gold standard, as you've heard before. And in the past, cost sharing could have been a barrier when screening colonoscopy was advised related to positive stool-based screening or when screening is warranted on an annual basis. Colonoscopies are a dreaded rite of passage for many middle-aged adults. With the reality, though, that we all know at least one individual or more in our lives that have lost a battle to their to colon cancer due to lack of screening. Requiring that insurance cover the cost of screening colonoscopy without a deductible, coinsurance, or other cost-sharing measures removes that barrier. Accurate and timely diagnosis of colorectal cancer can positively impact the health of individuals and promotes safe, quality patient care. The Nebraska Nurses Association asks that you move LB 383 out of committee to general file. We request that this letter be included as part of the public hearing record.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bostwick.
Yes.
Are there any questions from the committee? See none. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
Right. Additional proponent testimony for LB 383. See none. Is there any opposition testimony for LB 383? See none. Neutral testimony for LB 383. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Slama, members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. My name is Robert M. Bell. Last name is spelled B-E-L-L. I am the Executive Director of and Registered Lobbyist for the Nebraska Insurance Federation. I am here today to testify neutrally on LB 383. As you know, the Nebraska Insurance Federation is a state trade association of insurance companies, including most of the health insurance plans in the state of Nebraska. The health insurers appreciate Senator Bostar, or his villainous Dr. Bostar, for reaching out on LB 383 and then accepting our minor amendment that you saw before that. And actually, we worked with him a little bit before the session on the actual language of this. The insurance companies in Nebraska are not opposed to the provisions of LB 383. That's why we're here neutrally, because it would provide further clarification on state law to match federal requirements on colorectal cancer screening. Specifically, LB 383 addresses an issue surrounding whether or not a follow-up colonoscopy from a positive stool sample-based test would be considered preventative or diagnostic. Pursuant to the Federal Affordable Care Act, most preventative services, such as colonoscopies, are preventative and free from cost sharing. However, a diversity of opinions existed in the industry whether or not a follow-up colonoscopy was preventative or diagnostic. CMS, however, settled the issue with guidance a couple of years ago. So 383 clarifies state law on the issue and brings us into compliance with the federal guidance. As a result, the Federation is neutral on LB 383. Appreciate the opportunity to testify.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bell. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, additional neutral testimony for LB 383. Seeing none, as you're approaching for your close, Senator Bostar, we have 4 proponent letters for the record on LB 383.
All right, thank you, Chair Slama and members of the committee. And this is a pretty simple bill. It eliminates cost sharing for colonoscopies for people who are already eligible for colonoscopies without cost sharing. If that makes sense. It's just a matter of whether or not they did a at-home screening test first. The way our statutes currently read, it creates a disincentive for someone to do an at-home test. Because under the current statutes, if they did an at-home test first and there was a marker of concern, they would have to get a colonoscopy and it wouldn't be covered without cost sharing. Whereas if they had just gone and skipped the at-home test and just gone and got a colonoscopy, they wouldn't have cost sharing. So we're trying to make sure that healthcare incentives are aligned with producing the best outcomes for our patients, for costs of healthcare, and we're just aligning things. So I'm happy to answer any final questions.
All right, thank you, Senator Bostar. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Dr. Bostar, for your.
You are never living that down.
All right, that brings to a close LB 383. We'll now open up with LB 308. Senator Bostar, long time no see.
Indeed.
And if you're planning to be a proponent on this bill, please come up to the front just so we can move everything along. All right.
All of the testifiers on this bill.
All of them. I mean, there's crowds waiting outside.
Good afternoon, Chair Slama and fellow members of the Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. For the record, my name is Elliot Bostar, ELIOTBOSTAR, and I represent Legislative District 29. Today, I'm presenting LB 308, which adopts the Genetic Information Privacy Act. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing is widely popular. A Consumer Report survey found that about 1 in 5 Americans has taken a direct-to-consumer genetic test. Genetic information consists of our most sensitive and personal information. It uniquely identifies an individual, reveals their propensity to develop certain diseases, and gives insight on family, ethnic, and cultural background. Given the sensitive nature of genetic information, there are growing privacy concerns regarding direct-to-consumer genetic testing company data practices. Traditional genetic testing administered by healthcare providers is extensively regulated, but direct-to-consumer companies market directly to consumers, and currently there are few restrictions on how companies collect, analyze, store, share, or sell our personal genetic information. In response to growing concern, leading consumer privacy advocates, key policymakers, Ancestry, 23andMe, and other genetic testing companies created the Privacy Best Practices for Direct-to-Consumer Genetic Testing Services in 2018. Shortly after, the best practices were translated into model state legislation. 6 states have passed this legislation so far. They include Arizona, California, Kentucky, Maryland, Utah, and Wyoming. Nebraska would be the 7th if we rushed. I hear that there's a lot of other states considering this at the moment. Companies like Ancestry and 23andMe have good reason to support increased consumer privacy protections. Their business models depend on consumer trust. LB 308 ensures that the consumer is in control of their genetic data at all times and would require separate express consent for the following: before DNA is extracted from a biological sample and analyzed, before a biological sample is stored, for genetic data to be used for research purposes, for genetic data to be shared with a third party, and for genetic data to be used for marketing purposes. Also, genetic testing companies would be required to provide consumers with a means to delete their genetic data from their databases and close their accounts without unnecessary steps, destroy a consumer's biological sample within 30 days of a request, and provide clear and complete information about their privacy practices and protocols. Additionally, genetic testing companies would be prohibited from sharing genetic data with employers or providers of insurance for any reason. Finally, LB 308 provides that the Nebraska Attorney General may bring an action to enforce the provisions of the Genetic Information Privacy Act. As direct-to-consumer genetic testing grows in popularity, it is becoming increasingly important to enact regulatory guardrails to protect the privacy of Nebraska consumers. I urge the committee to advance LB 308, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Senator Bostar. Are there any questions from the committee? Yes, Senator Jacobson.
Thank you, Chair Slama. Senator Bostar, I'm looking really at the damages in particular, because obviously we can pass all kinds of statutes and laws and regulations, but ultimately, how does this get enforced? And so basically an action would have to be, you'd have to contact the Attorney General, they'd have to bring the action, and then it looks like the penalty is $2,500 per violation. I assume that means per person, or does it mean the number of people that they may have shared this information with? And I guess my big question is, how do we arrive at that 2,500, and do we think that's meaningful in terms of enforcing this new law?
That's a great question. You're right about the process of how that works. I believe it's per infraction, although I believe the testifier behind me will certainly be able to correct that if I'm mistaken.
Thank you.
Essentially, this legislation was created through a large national process and negotiations. So that those penalty numbers came from, all of the stakeholders related to this issue coming together and agreeing on these provisions, and that included working with insurers, for example, as well on the national level. And this is where everyone landed.
And this would apply to anyone sharing this information. So in other words, you get a direct consumer company that does this and they share it with a physician or health organization, and I presume it compounds with anybody who shares that information.
Yeah, and certainly that, under this bill, any of that sharing would be prohibited without your express consent.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senator Jacobson. Additional questions from the committee? See none. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Proponent testimony on LB 308. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair Slama and members of the committee. My name is Richie Engelhardt. That's RITCHIEENGELHARDT, and I'm the head of government affairs at Ancestry. Here today on behalf of the Coalition for Genetic Data Protection. Ancestry is proud of the work that we've done with our coalition partners, including 23andMe, to implement common sense privacy protections that ensure consumers are in control of their data at all times. Senator Bostar did a great job in detailing the provisions of the bill. Might have to hire you. We could always use another doctor on the team. So I'll be really brief. I'm not going to repeat everything that he said. In short, LB 308 ensures that consumers are in control of how their genetic data is collected, processed, and shared for the duration of their relationship with one of our companies. While Ancestry and 23andMe have adhered to these practices the entire time that we've offered DTC genetic testing products, LB 308 will ensure that every direct-to-consumer genetic testing service is held to the same standards for privacy and data protection. Senator Bostar was right. Our consumers' trust is our top priority. If people do not trust that we are employing privacy safeguards and data protection safeguards, they simply won't use our services. So we urge a favorable report on LB 308, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have. I can specifically circle back to Senator Jacobson's question. So it's per violation. So you could have multiple violations for one consumer if you share that data more than one time with more than one entity. Those numbers were largely conforming to FTC enforcement. So FTC was part of the discussions with Future Privacy Forum back in 2018. And for privacy violations, it's typically not the case where you've got one consumer's data that you just share one time with one person. It's sharing multiples. So those violations add up very quickly. And while that number might look smaller for an individual violation, it would be into the millions, no doubt, if somebody were to violate the rules and broker the data.
Thank you, Mr. Engelhardt. Are there any additional questions from the committee? Yes, Senator Cal.
Thank you, Senator Slama. One question, how would they find out that their data has been shared?
It's an excellent question. So one of the, probably the biggest risk in privacy when it comes to genetic data is that genetic data could be used for targeted advertising, right? You can learn a lot about a person from their genetics. You can learn their health risks. You can learn a lot about how they are composed physically. You can learn about their ethnic and racial background. So if you took that data and started marketing to a consumer based on that information, they'd probably figure it out pretty quickly. Like, wow, it looks like this company knows more about me than they should. And there are other consumer data protection laws that are being passed across the country that really try to rein in targeted advertising, giving consumers the ability at a minimum to opt out of those things. But that's the thing that would probably get a consumer's attention first, is if they started seeing advertising that looked like it was provisioned using their genetic information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cal. Senator Duncan.
Thank you, Chair Slama, and thank you for being here today. I know you and I chatted a little bit before the hearing, and you did an excellent job of explaining sort of the importance of this bill, and I think that's encapsulated here in what you handed out. Quick question I had for you that I neglected to ask yesterday, just because I think it could help me understand a little bit better. There's the subparagraph there that prohibits or requires valid legal process before disclosing genetic data to government agency, including law enforcement, without written consent. The language there, valid legal process, this is model legislation. So can you describe a little bit more of what that looks like?
Yeah,
Does that mean obtaining a warrant or?
Valid legal process would be a warrant or a subpoena, something presented to us from the courts that said you need to give this information over. So a lot of attention in this space has gone towards, cold cases that were solved using genetic databases. That's really not what that provision gets at. So it would be a valid legal process If we got a warrant for a specific person's DNA and we had that DNA, we would have to consider applying to that. For investigative genetic genealogy, where there's a cold case and they want to catch a bad guy, there's another service called GEDmatch that exists. And GEDmatch is an open source genetic database. It was started by genealogy enthusiasts about 10 years ago. And the premise was if I did Ancestry and you did 23andMe and the chair did MyHeritage, we could all download our raw data files, put it in a GEDmatch, and then see our matches across all platforms. It was a great idea. They also had a provision that was kind of buried in the terms of service that said for certain violent offenses, we'll let law enforcement upload profiles to try and identify unknown suspects in cold cases. So the way that works is Golden State Killer, they uploaded the genetic profile. They found a 7th cousin over here, maybe a 5th cousin over here. All they needed were a handful of known relatives, and then they got a really good genealogist to flesh out the rest of the family tree to identify that person. Privacy advocates were not happy when that happened because a lot of people whose data was in GEDmatch didn't even realize law enforcement could use it for that purpose. So GEDmatch ultimately did the right thing. They kicked everybody out of the database that law enforcement could access. They went back to their users and said, you're probably aware of what happened here. If you are comfortable with your data being used and processed for that purpose, you need to opt in. So all of the data that law enforcement now uses in cold case investigations is consented data for that purpose. The people to whom that data pertains have said, I am okay with you using it for this purpose if it gets a bad guy off the streets.
And under this, with the consumer's express written consent, the same information could be shared with law enforcement. They just have to consent to it.
Right. So neither Ancestry nor 23andMe allow law enforcement to do those types of searches in our database. We're really not set up for it. We don't have any way to upload third-party genetic information. It's a closed loop system. You do our tests, the results go into our system. That's the only way to get data in there. But we remind folks, GEDmatch is well set up for this. They've been doing it for a long time. The recent Idaho campus killer was caught using GEDmatch in a very similar fashion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Duncan. Additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Jane Sue. Testifying on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska. I'm testifying in support of LB 308. We thank Senator Bostar for introducing this legislation. There's nothing more private than your personal genetic information. Medical and genetic information can reveal some of the most personal and private data about us, and maintaining control over that information is crucial. As medical records are increasingly digitized and genetic sequencing becomes faster and cheaper, threats to our privacy and autonomy intensify. Genetic data can reveal many kinds of sensitive information about you, your ethnicity, your family health, your likelihood of developing certain diseases. So this bill specifically protects Nebraskans' genetic information, who have a right to protect their genetic information, to know that their genetic data is not going to be used for purposes beyond their consent. There are currently limited protections for disclosure and dissemination of personal and genetic information. I think there's one major federal law besides HIPAA that provides that protection. But LB 308 would require express consent to transfer or disclose the genetic data and separate express consent to retain the genetic information beyond the initial testing service. This bill would also prevent the open sharing of genetic information with law enforcement without that express consent, so thereby providing that extra layer of protection for the consumer. So we urge your support of this bill and to advance the bill out of committee. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. First question, could you please spell your name, please?
Sure. Jane Sue, Janeseu.
Thank you very much. Additional questions from the committee? See none. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Additional proponent testimony for LB 308? Any opponent testimony for LB 308? Seeing none. Any neutral testimony for LB 308? Seeing none. Senator Bostar, you're welcome to close. And as you come up, there is one proponent letter for the record on LB 308.
Thank you, Chair Slama and members of the committee. The afternoon looks a little different than the morning. I would appreciate your support for this legislation. I think it's sort of a common sense protection for Nebraskans. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any other questions the committee may have.
All right. Thank you,
Sorry,
Senator Boster.
there is an amendment that I handed out and didn't mention that it removes a clause of language that was in the model legislation that that our Attorney General asked to be removed in order to conform more appropriately with Nebraska statutes. And I also forgot something else. The executive director of TechNet tried to submit a letter. I guess there was a complication, wasn't able to. So I said that I would distribute it to the committee if that helps.
We'll let it slide.
And
Solid.
with that, I will answer any questions if there are any.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Bostar. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. This brings to a close our hearing on LB 308 and our hearings for this afternoon. If the committee could stick around for just 2 minutes, we'll have a quick